The destruction of the city, Eusebius says, came only after the Jerusalem Christians had made their escape. Did you hear that? The destruction of the city came only after the Jerusalem Christians had made their escape. All right, you're locked here again. This is another lesson in the New Testament is Fake series. Today's date is January 15th, 2017. This is lesson number 40. The lesson today is entitled 36.5. This lesson is going to deal with the destruction of Jerusalem. So eventually, as Jerusalem is being destroyed by Titus in AD 70, we find that the whole picture of the strength of this whole Jesus character is exposed a little bit more. Let me read from Mark chapter 13, verse 1 and 2. And as he went out of the temple, one of his disciples saith unto him, Master, see what manner of stones and what buildings are here. And Jesus answering said unto him, Seest thou these great buildings? There shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. So this saying of Jesus has been used as a prophecy from God or from the Spirit, from the Father, to show more truth about this supposed Son of God, because it is treated as a prophecy, and they say AD 70 proves this prophecy to be true. So Jesus was a prophet and he is of God, he's the Son of God, he's the Messiah, and so on. I'm going to challenge that today in a common sense kind of way. By the way, I really think this prophecy of Jesus is really late, right? Because they're making it sound like this was something unique. But I've pointed out, like so many have done in the past, that the New Testament only borrows from things that are in the Old Testament, right? So if Jesus here is saying there's going to be some kind of destruction or judgment coming to the people in Jerusalem, the Most High already prophesied that. He already told that through different prophets in the Old Testament, telling them that they're going to suffer in their land. They're going to be kicked out, they're going to be taken into captivity, and so on. So this is nothing new. All that's going on in AD 70 is just the fulfillment of the Most High's words from the Old Testament prophets, and not the fulfillment of what Jesus was saying. Let's look at Leviticus chapter 26. Let's go to verse 25. To show that the Most High already said there was going to be some pretty bad things coming to his people. Leviticus 26 verse 25. And I will bring a sword upon you. And isn't that what's going on here in AD 70? The sword is coming down upon them. So they're making it sound like Jesus was coming from heaven through somebody's womb as the Messiah / Son of God, and he's coming with these brand new prophecies and so on. These are just the prophecies that are from the Old Testament, right? So anybody could just get up and say this and that's going to happen, right? And maybe what Jesus should have done that was even better was to give the year, to say in year 70, it's going to happen. Then, okay, now we can probably try to give him a little bit more credit because he pinpointed the time, right? He could have told them when and who was going to do it, because what if it was not Titus, right? So he misses some opportunity to sell himself some more. But I will bring a sword upon you that shall avenge the quarrel of my covenant. Right? And so the New Testament is painting this picture like this is something happening to the Christians, that the Christians are being attacked and so on, right, for their gospel of preaching Jesus, and they're being told by the authorities, then do not preach and teach in this name and so on. But the Most High prophesied so long ago, saying the sword is going to come to destroy you, to avenge the quarrel of my covenant. And we know Christians didn't have no covenant with the Most High. But it shall avenge the quarrel of my covenant, and when ye are gathered together within your cities, I will send the pestilence among you, and ye shall be delivered into the hand of the enemy. Verse 28, then I will walk contrary unto you, also in fury, and I, even I, will chastise you 7 times for your sins. Now, I'm not sure if anyone would argue that this is some kind of fury in AD 70 in Jerusalem, and that they were being chastised, right? So, I mean, this prophecy, and not that it's only talking about the AD 70 problem, but we know there are the times that the children of Israel were persecuted or taken captives, right? Because they didn't walk right. We know the famous Babylonian and Assyrian captivities, and you look all through the book of Judges and so on. But, I mean, you got to see that this is already in the Old Testament. This is nothing new with Jesus, talking about these stones are going to crumble and fall and so on, right? Verse 31, and I will make your cities waste and bring your sanctuaries unto desolation. And didn't they say the Jerusalem temple was hit pretty bad? Destroyed? They walked out with whatever was inside there, and the Jews lost their temple, and they want to rebuild and so on. And bring your sanctuaries unto desolation, and I will not smell the savor of your sweet odors. Verse 33, and I will scatter you among the heathen. And didn't the Hebrews there run from Jerusalem? Those who weren't slaughtered. Right? They ran among the heathen, ran into parts of Africa trying to save their lives, right? While the Christians were saved. Now, I covered some of this already in other videos, right? But sometimes some of these things are going to overlap for what I'm trying to bring out in this video, right? And I will draw out a sword after you, and your land shall be desolate, and your cities waste, right? So we know that, they're basically, their life there in Jerusalem was done. It was over with. They're just taking off now. They're being attacked AD 70 and all that, right? Verse 37 and 38. And they shall fall one upon another, as it were before a sword, AD 70 sword, when none pursueth, and ye shall have no power to stand before your enemies. And surely if they had power to stand before their enemies, they wouldn't have fled. They would have been victorious. They didn't have any power to stand, so they took off. They were running. And ye shall perish among the heathen, and a lot died in the AD 70 massacre. And the land of your enemies shall eat you up. And we go on to find that in history. So this is nothing unique to Jesus, talking about some desolation is going to come. The Most High already dealt with that. The prophets talked about that a lot in the Old Testament. All right, so let's move on. Jerusalem is being fled from. Now, Titus destroys Jerusalem. Let's run over to the book of Luke. See, I'm reading more from the New Testament in this video than at other times. Luke chapter 21 and verse 20 to 22. And when ye shall see Jerusalem, Jesus is speaking here, compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let them which are in the midst of it depart out, and let not them that are in the countries enter thereinto. For these be the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. Days of vengeance, because the Most High already said, I told you in Leviticus 26, that he's avenging the quarrel of his covenant, right? They broke his covenant and so on. So this is nothing new, but he does talk about it here, though, Jesus, right? This destruction that's going to come. So now the Jerusalem church is prevailed against, right? We talk about, James, the brother of Jesus, and he was over the Jerusalem church and so on. My title here, I told you, is 36.5. And I just want it to be an interesting thought in your mind, right? That, I just cannot see how the common sense thinking person is going to deny this, right? See, you got to really think in a common sense kind of way, right? To understand what's going on with this whole New Testament trick. Now, if you look, but before I do that, let me just give you some more stuff from these two websites. preteristarchive.com. If you look here, they're talking about the Christian flight to Pella, and they reference Luke 21, verse 20 to 22, which I just read, right? Now they say here, Eusebius is saying, the members of the Jerusalem church, by means of an oracle given by revelation, and you see, I learned all along from I was a youngster coming up, the Jerusalem church was dealing with Jews, right, or Hebrews, right? But this word church starts coming to the picture so much in the New Testament to make it look like there's no, that the Most High is not really dealing with Hebrews anymore, with the children of Israel anymore. It's just everybody now. They kind of bring that in. And as you go more into history coming out of the New Testament times, you find that church no longer means the Hebrews who reached out with the gospel from the day of Pentecost to Gentiles, but now history starts to show more and more after New Testament times that church now just means Gentiles, or it just means people in general. And so even a Hebrew can come and get baptized. Even an Israelite can come and get baptized and receive Jesus, or get sprinkled and receive Jesus. You see how they gradually, excuse me, or in a subtle way, ease the Hebrews out of the scriptural picture, and slowly, like a frog being boiled, they get eased out of the picture and slowly paint in the picture Gentiles who are Christians becoming the children of God. Do you see what the New Testament did? It eased out the people the Creator was dealing with and eased in another people who the Creator wasn't dealing with in the Old Testament, right? Psalm 147, right? 19 and 20 saying, He gave His word unto Jacob, right? I just don't understand how people, just who actually read these things just don't see that, right? Go on here now. Eusebius is saying the Jerusalem church, by means of an oracle given by revelation to acceptable persons. And you have to understand that in the scripture, even Old Testament, but even Jesus himself, as the New Testament is putting it to us, he was dealing with his people, because he came to his own, he said. And when he was talking, even he himself was talking to the disciples. So what we find is that the Most High is dealing with these Israelites in the Old Testament, and even Jesus comes dealing with them as well. So you would think that the Jerusalem church is, if they're getting an oracle or some revelation from God, it would have been coming to the Hebrews. But as you go on reading this history, they start to turn it now to showing that it's just Christians or Gentiles that's getting word from God directly, right? But the Jerusalem church, by means of an oracle given by revelation to acceptable persons there, were ordered to leave the city before the war began and settle in a town in Perea, if that's how you pronounce it, called Pella. That's book 3, 5, verse 4. Okay, let me click on this other link here called Remember Pella, and I'm still at preteristarchive.com. Okay, Preterist Idealism, The Wintry Flight, 1876. So they're quoting here now. All who believed in Jesus Christ remembered what he had said and left their homes hurriedly and fled to a little town called Pella. Now look at what they're doing here. They said all who believed in Jesus Christ, yet they tell you that the Israelites believed in Jesus and they spread the gospel to the Gentiles, and then they're basically saying, so Gentiles now become the Christians, and the Hebrews are trying to tell you it was the Christians as well, because it's all one thing now. There's no longer Jew or Greek and all. We're just one now, right? Yet, apparently, all who believed in Jesus Christ, you remember what he said, and later now they're going to tell you that those all who believed were the Christians who were saved because they heeded him. Well, didn't the Israelites believe in Jesus Christ as well? So why don't they, since they're no more living like Jews or acting like Jews or going by the old covenant, since they believe in Jesus and they are now one with Christians and Gentiles who believe in Jesus, since they have left off the law as they want us to believe, why, with their affinity to Jesus Christ and this gospel, don't they get saved as well, like the Christians do? You see, there's still a distinction, but it's all trickery. So all who believed in Jesus Christ remembered what he had said, and left their homes hurriedly and fled to a little town called Pella. But apparently the Hebrews were so dumb that they wouldn't do that either. The Hebrews, who had been subject to so many different captivities and punishments from the Most High, apparently they don't have the smartness of mind to realize that, oh, the Most High is punishing again, so since we're used to that, we'd better run as well. Let's run with the other Christians as well to save our lives as well. But no, they keep acting in the same dumb way and decide, no, we're just going to stay here and get slaughtered. But the Christians are smart enough to run and hide. So they fled to a town called Pella on the other side of the river Jordan. Not one Christian perished in the siege of Jerusalem. You see that? Not one. They didn't say only a few, because they're trying to tell you all Christians were smart because they believed in Jesus. They're smart enough to be in the spirit enough to heed the warning of Christ. Not one Christian perished. So they're trying to make you know that law keepers are dumb and they're idiots because they don't have the smartness to even save their lives by listening to their own Messiah, the Son of God, who reached out to Gentiles. They're smart enough as the Israelites to get the upper room experience and come out and preach the gospel on the day of Pentecost to everybody else so that thousands and thousands and thousands can be saved, but they're not smart enough to do what those saved Gentiles end up doing by listening to the Jesus that they preached to them in the first place. So the Jews who had refused to believe, or the Hebrews who had refused to believe in Jesus, in their own Hebrew Jesus, trusted to their strong walls and their weapons and stayed in the city. Now, my children, I have not told you these things only as a chapter of history. I want you to learn some very important lessons from these words. For us there is an escape, a flight to be undertaken, and for us there is a place of refuge like Pella. Let's read a little bit more here. Now, click on another one of their links, talking about did Christians flee to Pella. And it's still at preteristarchive.com. Josephus, right? Henry Leeming now talking about Josephus' Jewish War and its Slavonic version, a synoptic comparison, 2003. This volume presents in English translation the Slavonic version of Josephus Flavius' Jewish War, long inaccessible to Anglophone readers according to the scholarly edition. Did Jerusalem Christians flee to Pella? See? So as time goes on, dealing with this New Testament period and after, less is mentioned about the Hebrews, except that they were just slaughtered now, because that's all they want, because they want to put them out of the picture. And the Christians are just the ones being dealt with now, right? So this did Jerusalem Christians flee to Pella by J. Julius Scott, Wheaton College, 1998, and so on, right? Evidence from biblical, historical, archaeological, and critical studies. Okay, the abstract. Early Christian historians Eusebius and Epiphanius claim that prior to the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in AD 70, the Jerusalem Christians fled to the Decapolis city of Pella. And they give some references. They said, note also, well, dealing with the whole prophecy supposedly of Jesus in Mark 13 verse 14, Matthew 24:15, Luke 21, 20-22, which I read already, and so on. During the last half of the 20th century, critical scholars have debated the accuracy of this report. So there seems to be some back and forth from some people on it, right? This paper begins with a summary of the source material and contemporary critical reaction to the account of the flight to Pella by the Jerusalem Christians. It continues with a brief description of the site of ancient Pella, Tabakat Fahil, the history of its occupations, and a notation of archaeological work there. The first, if I pick up partway down the page, if you want to read the whole page, that's good. The first clear reference comes from the 4th century church historian Eusebius. He says that as the Romans approached the city, the people belonging to the church at Jerusalem had been ordered by an oracle revealed to approved men on the spot before the war broke out, to leave the city and dwell in a town of Perea called Pella. The destruction of the city, Eusebius says, came only after the Jerusalem Christians had made their escape. Did you hear that? The destruction of the city came only after the Jerusalem Christians had made their escape. But this same Christian New Testament history is telling you that the Hebrews were not the ones to escape, they were slaughtered. So what they're telling you there, even though they try to make you feel that New Testament Christians is real, or the New Testament gospel is about everybody and we're all one, and that there's really, like Paul said, no Jew or Greek or Gentile or Jew and Jew, whatever it said. Even though they're trying to tell you that in the New Testament, the reality on the ground of how it played out is that there was a difference between Christians and the Hebrews, and that whoever was destroying Jerusalem waited in a planned, careful way to ensure that Christians ran and hid first and got out of the way and went into safety and then slaughtered the Hebrews, because it was Hebrews they were after. They were preserving the Christians because Rome created Christianity with the Christian message of Jesus Christ, the Messiah, who obviously, if the Hebrews were running, it's because they didn't believe in him. So they were being slaughtered to get them out of the way, to turn Jerusalem not into a Hebrew place anymore, but a Christian place. The Roman attack upon Jerusalem, a little bit more down the page. Josephus describes the AD 66 to 70 war in great detail, especially in his The Wars of the Jews. Two events are important for our study. At the outset of the war, AD 66 to 67, the legate of Syria, Cestius Gallus, approached Jerusalem with the 12th Legion and occupied the northern suburb. He didn't have sufficient forces to take the rest of the city, so he withdrew. His army was ambushed in the Beth Horon Pass and suffered heavy losses. In late spring of 68, the Roman general Vespasian had reduced the region beyond the Jordan, western Judea, and Idumea to the south. Alright, so they give a little bit more history here. And you don't hear anything about the Christians fighting them, right? This is all the Jews, as they call them, or the Hebrews, right? So when finally the Romans attacked Jerusalem, who would they be attacking Jerusalem for and because of? The Hebrews. Christians weren't fighting them back, right? It's the Hebrews. This is all something about the Hebrews to establish a Christian city with a Christian gospel from a Christian Jesus. Okay, so I think I've read enough here. For us who know this stuff, especially the Hebrews, we know the whole AD 70 stuff, but this just helps the Christian-minded person to understand that something really happened in AD 70. That's why I went through all of that, because as I grew up in church all those years, I didn't know anything about AD 70. That some serious things happened there, right? So I went into all that to show the Christian-minded person who just stays in church all the time and don't read, that something happened at AD 70, right? And out of that war and destruction that happened, the Christians were saved as the Romans waited until the Christians went carefully to safety and then slaughtered. And you have to keep in mind as well too, if the Christians were getting out of the way and they were given time to do so, why weren't the Hebrews getting out of the way? If you're in the same city and you see a sizable portion of the population all identified by a certain political belief or religion, wouldn't you think, especially back in those times, wouldn't you think, and then you see the armies surrounding the place, wouldn't you think something's going on and that they're coming for us? Because everybody else who is a part of the state religion is being ushered carefully to safety. Wouldn't you say, okay, they're coming for us now? As Hebrews, wouldn't you say that? So then why wouldn't the Hebrews run? Because that's their home. Where are they going to go? They only eventually ran because a lot of them were now being slaughtered. But at first they're going to stand and fight because that's their home. That's their city. Right? So when all these Christians, everybody else is leaving and fleeing now to safety carefully, the Hebrews were not running because they were the target. So being the target, they were bracing themselves to fight. And the Christians who said they had the same Jesus and said that we are all one, never helped them to fight. Why? Because the Christians didn't want the Hebrews around anyway. They never spoke up for them, never fought for them, never fought with them alongside them, never resisted with them against the Romans and said this is not right, we're all one. The state religion, Christianity, but we are all one through the same Jesus. Christians never spoke up and pushed back like that for them, right? So anyway, 36.5. Now that we know that the war happened around about AD 70, let's go with 70 because that's a popular figure and that's what they said, right? And if we go with 0 AD when apparently Jesus was born, some say, okay, it might have been 2 BC, 4 AD, 2 AD, whatever, right? We just normally go with 0 AD. And it will still get my point across. If you keep in mind this supposed prophecy Jesus gave that says a destruction is going to come. And he also said, upon this rock I will build my church and the gates of hell shall not prevail. Then you got the Jerusalem church flourishing and going on. And he's born in 0 AD. Then the war comes in 70. Now if you keep in mind that Jesus was on earth for about 33 and a half years. Right? And he says this destruction is going to come. But the gates of hell will not prevail. And we know when you deal with the gates of hell shall not prevail, that means he's telling you they're not going to win against the church. We're going to flourish, we're going to grow. This is built upon a rock. It's not going to go down. Now, prevail, it means defeat. Now, if someone wants to tell me, yeah, but the church is still around today. Of course it is. Because the church was the one doing the prevailing. That's what you need to keep in mind. Now, if you go back in the day, let's say in David's time now, if Israel is going to war and they lost, that means the enemy, whoever they're fighting, prevailed against them, right? They won. If Israel had to flee, that means the enemy prevailed. Well, if the Hebrews who started the church and gave the message to the Gentiles, doesn't it mean that the church started with the Hebrews from the day of Pentecost? So the Hebrews are the church and they brought in the Gentiles by preaching the gospel to them? So you got this Jerusalem church that's there. And when the Romans came in, the Jerusalem church was destroyed, right? Was it destroyed? You say, well, no, not quite. Well, then did it prevail? Was it valiant in battle, in fighting, in resisting, like the Hebrews are used to doing in the Old Testament? Where is it prevailing? If they had to run and hide to get out of the way of the Romans to prevent a massacre of themselves. If the Christians are the church, why did they run and hide in Pella? Because when war is coming, if people run and hide, that means somebody else has the power to prevail over them. Somebody else prevailed. So they ran and hid in Pella. The Jerusalem church was broken up. Or they ran and got out of the way because they were running. The Romans prevailed over everybody. They prevailed over the Jerusalem church and prevailed over the Hebrews. The Romans prevailed in AD 70. That means, how long did the Jerusalem church or the Christian movement last with any amount of power? Until the time when they had to run and hide, which means lack of power. Even though Jesus said the gates of hell shall not prevail, or the gates of hell shall not have power over, the gates of hell will not pressure you to the point where you got to run and hide because you got the power. How long? Jesus lived about 33 and a half years, they tell us. So from 0 AD to 33 and a half, then he's gone. So if you take away that 70, AD 70, minus the, because right after he left, the church started, Day of Pentecost and so on, right? So you have to count the time the Jerusalem church flourished, because the church technically wasn't really up and running and started while Jesus was actually here. It's after he left, right after. And they preached Day of Pentecost message and so on, and 3,000 were added to the church and so on, right? So you're talking from 33 and a half AD to AD 70 is how long Jerusalem church lasted. So 70 minus that 33.5 when Jesus left and went to heaven, they say, equals 36.5 years. That's why I call it 36.5, to show you that the gates of hell prevailed against the Jerusalem church and the Christian or church movement of the Messiah, that God was doing through the Messiah, they say. It only lasted, that church, 36 and a half years that was supposedly built upon a rock. 36.5 years until Titus, with a Roman Gentile army, had the power enough to prevail against it. And while the Hebrews were slaughtered and ran, the Christians also didn't get slaughtered, but also ran. They fled and they hid. At least the Hebrews had enough guts to stand and fight. They got more guts than the Christians. Why? Because they were the ones the truth was given to. And you will fight and die for what is yours. It was their land, their city, Jerusalem, their truth, their God, their Bible, their law, their everything. That the Christians couldn't claim Jerusalem, it's not theirs. They couldn't claim what we would call the Bible today, it's not theirs. So they just ran and hid. Because it wasn't theirs. 36.5 years is how long it took for that Jerusalem church to prevail with the gospel, or to be powerful and strong with the gospel, preaching and teaching in Jesus' name, making people get filled with the Holy Ghost and so on, they say. 36.5 years is all the time that lasted. And then throughout time they had to rebuild again, right? That's all the time it lasted. When you very well know that same Jesus in the New Testament said, the gates of hell shall not prevail. Is there a problem when you think of it? Is there a problem? Why are you having such a problem in your mind? Because you know there is no way a Gentile army should prevail against the mightiest, powerful move of God since Sinai and since the ark. That mighty move of power and fire and cloven tongues like fire coming on in the day of Pentecost, people being healed by people's hands left, right, and center, dead being raised and so on, and some Gentile armies with swords just come and just break the whole thing up? God's doing a new thing through Jesus and a little Gentile army who were first, when they tried, as I read already from the preteristarchive.com, when they first came, they couldn't do the full attack in AD 66 because they didn't have enough manpower, right? And when they were retreating, they were even beaten. They didn't even have enough. So they weren't strong enough as yet. That's why they had to come back now and squash the whole rebellion and so on of the Hebrews, right? And come with more army personnel, right? So they weren't strong enough to even come and squash everything at first. And yet the power of God through Jesus wasn't enough to take down the Romans. So the Hebrews went through a lot of wars. We know sometimes they lost because of their transgressions. But once they were living right, and they were in their heyday, you might say, they were winning the wars, and even under David, right? But the first war Christians had to face through the power of Jesus in AD 70, they ran and hid. And you tell me they have the power through this Jesus New Testament? No. Something's wrong with that. The Hebrews had the truth, and they were massacred because they were hated for having the truth of the law of the Most High. And the rest of them who survived, they fled with the truth. And now we are scattered. And the Most High is going to wake us up again. 36.5, something's wrong with this New Testament. That's all the time that the New Testament church lasted until it was prevailed again. But Jesus said the gates of hell shall not prevail.